Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this installment of the Exploring Sustainable Seafood virtual panel series. My name is Kim Thompson. I am the director of the Aquarium of the Pacific Seafood for the Future program. Earlier this year, a company seeking permits to farm in U.S. waters held a public comment session. In that session, they received more than 47,000 comments. Not all were bad, and many were chain sign-on letters, but still, this is a demonstration of the passion that people have for the ocean as a common resource. Whether or not these comments will impact the final permitting decision remains unseen. What is clear, however, is that the public did have a very active and important role in the process. Today, we're going to be discussing the roles that community and society play in the development of marine aquaculture in countries like the US and the UK. I'm pleased to welcome our panelists. We have Suzi from the Scottish Association for Marine Science. We have Luke Fairbanks from the University of Southern Mississippi, and Paul Dobbins from World Wildlife Fund. You can find their bios and additional resources from this and other discussions in this series at aquariumofpacific.org. Now let's dive in by getting to know a little bit about our panelists. Luke, we're going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about your work, and is it anywhere close to what you thought you were going to be doing when you first applied to college?
First of all, thanks for having me. So I'm an assistant research professor at the University of Southern Mississippi. I'm an environmental social scientist and a human geographer. A lot of my work, I study sort of ocean and coastal, ocean and coastal policy and people's relationship with the ocean. So a lot of my projects are focused on things like ocean planning, protected areas, and especially marine aquaculture. So a lot of my ongoing work looks at what people's values are associated with aquaculture and with seafood production, and also how we develop policy and management for marine aquaculture. So I will say that what I do now is similar to what I wanted to do way back in college and before college. I thought when I was a kid I wanted to be a marine biologist. I'm not a marine biologist, although I know a lot of marine biologists, so I figure it's kind of close. But I did always know I wanted to work on ocean issues. So after college, I pursued grad school to do basically what I'm doing now. And yeah, I've been at it ever since.
Great. Suzi, how about you? What are you working on? And is what you're doing now anywhere close to what 18-year-old Suzi thought she would be doing when she applied for college?
For the second question, no, not really. So at the moment, I'm working on several projects. They're mainly looking at the interactions of coastal communities with different uses of the sea. So that's all the way from aquaculture through to fisheries, through to co-location with aquaculture and marine renewables, and how we can try and move to more sustainable use of the sea that includes coastal communities' knowledge and perspectives. Yeah, and I guess I've always been interested in the sea. Like Luke, and chose a course that was aligned with that in college. But I don't think I ever saw myself as doing a social science PhD, to be honest, or following an academic career, but there you go.
And Paul, how about you? You are a farmer in the group. Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing, and tell us if it's anywhere close to what you thought you were going to be doing when you were applying for college.
Well, it's as far from what I thought I'd be doing when I was applying from college, as you can imagine, in one respect, because I went to college for business and spent 35 years in the private sector building up businesses. But in college, I also worked on the water and have a great love for the ocean. And I could never imagine it that I would be in a position that I'm in now, where I can combine my business career with my passion for the ocean and folks that work on the water. And that's a lead into what I do. I'm the Senior Director for Impact Investing at World Wildlife Fund US, and I'm also the seaweed and shellfish specialist. I recently retired as a seaweed and shellfish farmer.
Great. So we have these diverse perspectives. It's great to have the academic and then also the applied knowledge of the farmer, and also working now with the investment piece with World Wildlife Fund. And these are all important pieces for the discussions about the social elements of development activities like marine aquaculture. Public engagement is required by law for any development project, including marine aquaculture. As I mentioned, some of the public comment periods can result in a lot of activity. So Luke, we're going to start with you. Who are some of these stakeholders in these communities who are actively engaged in these discussions about marine aquaculture, and what are they concerned about? Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess the first thing to think about is that the stakeholders that have interests or concerns about aquaculture can vary, sometimes dramatically depending on the scale or the species that's being farmed, or depending on whether we're talking about maybe a policy development or the permitting and development of an individual farm. But with that said, so for maybe at a larger scale, you could have groups involved from seafood companies to large environmental nonprofits that might have competing or divergent interests and sometimes overlapping interests. You get a lot of involvement from members of the public, particularly as you mentioned, when there's campaigns, for instance, in protest of a farm. You can get a lot of people engaged in the commenting process. At more local levels, especially with smaller farms and communities, you'll see a lot more engagement really from local people commenting on these things. They might write letters to their state or local shellfish agency if they have concerns about conflicting uses or maybe issues with recreation or with fishing. So you'll see people getting involved ranging from fishermen to local landowners to folks that might recreate on the water. But on the other hand, there's a lot of interest in aquaculture as a potential development policy. So I think on a large scale and on a small scale, you'll see a lot of support from people that are interested in, using aquaculture to develop a new industry, especially in the United States, whether it's for economic development on a community level, particularly in rural or coastal places, or whether it's more thinking about just the broader seafood industry and seafood sector in this country generally. So point being is I think the comments can come from a lot of different places. We do often, I feel like, see a lot of opposition comments because folks can get really mobilized around issues like environmental concerns and want to express that when it comes to something that in the United States at least is often considered a new or different use in a lot of coastal and ocean spaces. So there still remains a lot of concerns about those things.
And Suzi, how about in the UK? Who are some of the stakeholders who are actively engaged in discussions about marine aquaculture there, and what are they concerned about? Is it similar to what Luke just mentioned in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. Very similar. So for your national scale, you have your big NGOs, you have your policy stakeholders, and you have folk who are looking at changing national policy. And then at a more local level and regional level, you have people that become more mobilized when you've got planning permission for a specific site. And that can trigger a different set of stakeholders to start commenting. So your site-specific stakeholders, for example, can include your grassroots environmental NGOs, your interested and engaged individuals within that local area, your community councils and your planning authorities, as well as the industry that's trying to get planning permission. And I guess some of the topics that are talked about largely depends on what aquaculture system we're talking about. So if it's low trophic aquaculture, it's probably more along the lines of access to the sites. So kind of seeing who is there already, who's functioning in that area, and how you can ensure that no one loses out significantly. Whereas if you're talking about the higher trophic aquaculture, so if you're talking about salmon and finfish, other finfish like trout, it's more about, as Luke says, the environmental impacts, the wild fish interactions and impacts of treatments that on wildlife more generally.
Just to recap what you guys were saying, there are a diverse number of people and communities who are interested in these projects, mostly from local groups, and they could be concerned about issues anywhere from the environment, which tends to mobilize a lot of people, but it could also be about jobs and livelihoods. It could also be about access to that resource, whether it be from a recreational perspective or maybe from a commercial, maybe fishing perspective. Am I capturing that correctly?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one of the other things that's important is that it also depends what your livelihood is. You really hit the nail on the head there. So if your livelihood comes from the sea and someone's putting in planning permission for allocation of space in an area that you use, that can be really quite concerning. And likewise, if you're, for example, a farmer, you're really going to want to work closely with your fishers and your recreational users to make sure that you can expand if you want to expand, and you're not causing conflict where it's undue.
So ultimately, it's about being a good neighbor. So Paul, speaking about farmers and being good neighbors, so we just heard from Suzi and Luke from the 30,000-foot view, right? From the academic, the objective outside view, but you've actually experienced it firsthand as a farmer. So can you provide some examples of experiences as a farmer engaging with local communities on some of these issues?
Sure, I'd echo what Suzi and Luke said. All of the stakeholders that they've identified happen right down at the very granular level of your particular portion of the bay. There's a lot of interest in what's happening on the ocean, and where we farmed, there was an awful lot of activity. And so it was all about knowing your neighbors and communicating with your neighbors and understanding what not only the kind of the physical nature of the bay, but the cultural nature of the bay. What was that particular water used for? What's the existing use? There are very few pieces of water in North America that aren't employed in some fashion by the people who live along the shore. So whether it's recreation or logistics or defense or transportation or fishing, it's really, really important to know specifically what's going on. And different areas have different cultures. And I'll give a quick example. We had a farm application that was going between two islands. And one island was adamant that they did not want to see aquaculture around in what they considered their waters. The other island embraced it and wanted to know if their kids could have jobs there. And these islands were separated by less than half a mile of water, but they had very different cultures. And so our experience was really understand the culture of the water in which you hope to farm and be really good neighbors before you even begin the process.
And that's interesting that they were so close yet so far apart, and how they were perceived by those local communities.
Absolutely, yeah, it was amazing.
So, Suzi, I want to talk about some of the research that you recently did. So as we've mentioned, one of the ways that the public can get engaged with these projects and provide feedback and comment is through the regulatory process. So the UK, just like the US, when development activities are proposed, there is an environmental impact assessment, and then the public has the opportunity to comment. And you recently reviewed these comments and their impact on marine aquaculture development in the UK. So can you tell us who the stakeholders were that you found were actually engaging specifically in the public comment process, and how did their comments impact the development of marine aquaculture? What were your findings?
So yeah, I looked at aquaculture in Scotland, in particular finfish aquaculture, so salmon and trout. And what I found was it was these local scale NGOs who were the main commenters, community councils, fisheries boards, for the most part. And in some cases, the local scale NGOs, they actually ran campaigns to try and get more people involved, especially within towns and in the region. So a lot more members of the general public then were coming along and commenting on these planning applications. And what I found really interesting was in the applications that didn't have these campaigns, you had this really granular scale that Paul was talking about. But in the applications where there were campaigns running, you had people from all over the world commenting and saying, you know, we don't like this, we really do like this, and everyone piled in with an opinion. So I found that really interesting. And I guess to your second question about the impact that they can have on the planning processes. So here in the UK, where there are material concerns expressed by these stakeholders and members of the general public, then the planning process takes this into account, and you can have extra consultation and extra reviews. And then when there's a significant enough discontent, if there's, say, lots of comments on lots of planning applications across the board, then you can actually have a parliamentary review. So that goes to your national scale government. They collect evidence and they assess it, and then our democratic representatives provide recommendations for policy. And there was one of those recently with salmon aquaculture. So the Scottish Parliament actually did a review of the whole of the salmon aquaculture industry, looking at evidence across the board from all types of different stakeholders. So engaging in the planning process at this local scale does actually interact with national scale policy.
So public voices really can have an impact in these cases.
Absolutely, yeah. And if there's enough of them, and if they really are material concerns like visual impacts, environmental concerns, and if they're specific enough, then they are listened to.
So Luke, here in the US, we have the National Environmental Policy Act, which is our regulatory mechanism for that public comment period on the environmental impact assessments. So can you tell us from the US perspective, who are the people engaging specifically in these comment periods, and has it had an impact on the development of marine aquaculture in the US?
Sure. So in the United States, one thing to think about is where the potential aquaculture is going to be located. So if you're within 3 miles of shore, typically the majority of the rules and management implementation, falls to the state, at least at the first stage of things. And then if you try to go beyond that into the offshore environment, the federal government typically manages the majority of that work. So for instance, for farms that have tried or are trying to develop in the offshore environment, you do see kind of this broader maybe input from a variety of stakeholders that might be opposed to developing aquaculture in the offshore environment for a few reasons. The first is that these farms there aren't many of them in the US. It's a kind of an undeveloped industry. The second is it's unfamiliar waters, so there's a lot of folks still raising concerns about what it could mean, and also since it's at its early stages, kind of how things develop now can set the stage and precedent for later on. So the farm that you mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, I think there was a lot of different folks that were opposed or offering opposition comments through things like campaigns. Concerns about environmental risks, not necessarily, not even always known environmental impacts, but it's really a question of risk and what we don't know. And I think that uncertainty is really, can really be a strong force in mobilizing comments and engagement from a whole variety of stakeholders. On the other hand, as a potential new industry in offshore spaces, I think that you will see, and you do see, supporting comments from folks kind of at that policy, more national economic sort of development level that are interested in seeing a new sector develop, ideally responsibly and sustainably. I guess, at the local level, a lot of what Suzi said is applicable here in the US for certain. The process of sort of engagement and if there's opposition, escalation can vary from state to state, but those local voices can play a big role in whether a farm, an individual farm in coastal waters is approved or not. And it's not unusual for a lot of opposition, particularly from users that have conflicting uses or from coastal landowners concerned about views and viewshed. Those things can, definitely in fact, inhibit or prohibit sometimes the development of aquaculture, things like shellfish aquaculture. So, there's a variety of ways to get involved. I think and they do matter. And similarly, the support does matter. It can go a long way if folks are, supporting particular individual operations or developments on a larger scale.
So, as you both mentioned, there are a variety of ways. So we just touched upon the public comment periods that are attached to the regulatory mandates through mechanisms like the National Environmental Policy Act here in the U.S. But what are some other ways in which public audiences can engage if they have concerns about marine aquaculture? You also mentioned environmental campaigns, but are there other ways that the public engages in these discussions and potentially have some impact? Suzi, we'll start with you.
So I think actually the campaigns are one of the main ways that the public engages. So there are quite a few local scale ENGOs here in Scotland and coastal community networks as well. And they meet up and they talk more generally about their vision for sustainable use of their local seas. And what's really interesting, I think, is that these discussions used to almost be entirely anti-salmon aquaculture, but now they're kind of moving on to how can we provide a different type of industry that's more sustainable. And they're actually looking to low trophic aquaculture, so shellfish and seaweed, as an alternative. And I think that's really interesting, especially since the Scottish model is currently dominated by salmon aquaculture. So the public and the people who are engaging in these conversations are essentially driving this change to alternatives.
And so they're driving that through these campaign processes.
Through campaign processes and also through these local networks. I don't know if you probably have them in the States as well, but where folk are mobilized around a particular issue, sometimes those networks stay and they keep talking to each other and it kind of develops into something else. And that seems to be what's happened here.
Luke, how about here in the U.S.? I mean, again, outside of the regulatory comment periods, and I mean, are the campaigns the main other mechanism that people can get engaged in these discussions, or are there other mechanisms and other ways that people engage in these discussions about marine aquaculture development in these communities?
Yeah, I would say at a broader national scale, something like a campaign is a common way for folks to get involved. But I think when the rubber hits the road for actually siting farms, and Paul could certainly speak to this more, a lot of times the engagement isn't necessarily through the formal pathways of public comment or public meeting. Typically, in addition to having a comment period, there are also meetings to discuss the siting of a specific farm in a specific place. But a lot of states have almost kind of formal, I guess the way to put it would be formal, informal processes where they encourage prospective farmers to go and discuss things with their potential neighbors. So other users, other landowners, people that will be interacting with the farm, folks in the community, people that might feel that they could be negatively impacted or might actually be negatively impacted. And whether it's sort of an encouraged or a required part of the process to get a farm, or whether a prospective farmer kind of takes it upon themselves to do that engagement, or whether a community has developed their own process to kind of engage people on new aquaculture developments. Those sorts of informal engagements can be really powerful in sort of deciding the fate of farm development when the rubber hits the road in specific places, in specific communities where these sorts of things happen. Because they can be ways to develop trust, to understand sort of that culture that Paul talked about. And those are really critical to, I think, the success of any farm development, never mind the continued success of a farm, down the line as it persists in the marine environment.
As we mentioned before, ultimately it's two-way dialogue, right? You need to engage, the communities want to engage with the project and provide their feedback, but it's also the responsibility then of the producer or the farmer then to engage with the communities and build that trust. It's about, again, being a good neighbor, right?
Yeah, absolutely. To build on what Luke and Suzi said, in our region where I farmed, every bay had a Friends of the Bay group. Concerned citizens, they were concerned about water quality and usage, and it was an informal network. And a great example of engagement was we had a Friends of the Bay. It was 16 families that lived on a particular point to come out and say, we really don't want aquaculture in front of our bay. We don't think it's a good thing. But in talking to them, we said, would you come out and see what it looks like? And they said, okay, they were willing to come out. And so we took some representatives out on our lobster boat and we ran them over a farm, a seaweed farm, for about 20 minutes doing lazy eights. And they said, when are we going to get to the farm? And we said, we've been over it for 20 minutes. And then we pulled it up and they looked, and it really started a great discussion. And they went from petitioning the governor of our state to not allow this to happen, to writing a conditional letter of support in what we were doing, because of that dialogue, their willingness to come and look, and our willingness to engage and say, we'll put in the time to do some education. And so that's a really a good example of when it's worked. We've seen when others, we had an instance in our region where a riparian owner, a shorefront owner, decided that he didn't want an oyster farm near his house. And so he had a very well thought out marketing campaign to keep this from happening. And it was both at the local level, where he organized and brought in PR people, and at the national level. He took out advertisements in National Fishermen that said, this is not a good thing. And so these things can go either way. They can have a really positive ending, like the first example, or they can be pretty acrimonious. And it really comes down to, again, the culture of where you're trying to farm. And I always counsel potential farmers, look, the best thing you can do is really know your water and really understand what's going on before you start the process, before you do a site selection. And then to Suzi's comment about fishermen, what we're seeing, and I'm seeing this in all the coasts that I visit, is we're starting to see fishermen become farmers. They're not leaving fisheries. They're staying in fisheries, but in seasons where there's no longer a species for them to fish because it's just not there anymore for whatever reason, they're filling in that time with the low trophic aquaculture because it's easier to get into with seaweed and shellfish farming. And we're seeing that not only happen in North America and Canada, America and Canada, but we're seeing that happen in Europe. We're seeing it happen in Africa. We're seeing it happen in Asia. It's an interesting trend. And that changes the nature of the dialogue around social license, because now we have people who may have 15 generations of their family working in a particular location on the water. And that's a very different discussion. And there's a lot more social license to farm when it's a fisherman that's bringing the application forward.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and kind of talk about the bigger picture. So we've been talking about how communities are engaging with these local projects, but climate change is here now. We need bold and innovative strategies to ensure that we can meet the needs of the growing population while also reducing our environmental footprint and addressing climate change. Research indicates that moving some of our food production to the ocean, including well-managed wild capture fisheries and responsible marine aquaculture, can help accomplish these goals if it is done responsibly. And an important part of responsible development, as we've been discussing here, is also that two-way public engagement. The public has to be engaged in these efforts. So Luke, we'll start with you. What if these communities are not comfortable with these projects being developed in their backyards? And how do we reconcile these very important and valid concerns with local communities and stakeholders with the needs of society at large to meet these bigger challenges?
I mean, that's kind of the big question, really, a lot of times. And, I think there's a couple ways to think about it. I think the first thing is that we often, when we talk about marine aquaculture development and expansion, particularly in the U.S. over the past few years, we often start from the top down. So we think about how can we reform government policies at federal and state levels? How can we implement new management systems that might enable or encourage the industry? And that process is all well and good, but oftentimes you kind of risk maybe overlooking the on the ground impacts. When we set targets for aquaculture development or we write policies that can enable it, it has to happen somewhere. And it happens in communities, it happens in rural places, it happens along all different coastlines. So, maybe simultaneously or alternatively thinking about how we can develop aquaculture kind of from the bottom up. So working with communities, building trust, understanding the cultural and economic realities of different places, and then use that to kind of grow the industry and reach, things like policy goals. And kind of just maybe flipping that focus at a policy level and a management level could go a long way to kind of building more trust and understanding and partnerships with communities where these things actually happen. And that can help maybe remove some of the adversarial feelings that especially grow at that local and community level. The second thing is, to look for points of consensus. A lot of times, folks that are opposed and folks that are proponents to aquaculture, there's things that they agree on. They just agree that just the methods of getting there are different. For instance, sustainable oceans, clean water, sustainable food production. So, try to find those points of consensus and then build the discussion out from there, rather than oftentimes you're kind of, beating your head against the wall with sort of pro-development and pro-conservation or pro-aquaculture and pro-fishing or whatever it may be, that it can be hard to find any productive middle ground that could actually result in development and productive conversation within communities. So, I think there's different ways forward. I think just trying to recenter community concerns is probably a really important one. And, if we do that, I think there might be new creative ways to develop aquaculture more appropriately and more agreeably for a lot of people and places.
Paul, do you have anything to add to how we reconcile, understanding or respecting the concerns that local communities have in terms of concerns of having these projects in their backyards with the need to meet the growing demands of society?
Sure. When I look at social license, it's really, we're operating in the commons. We need society's approval to do it. And that happens at a micro level. It's really in the bay or the piece of coastline in which you're operating. And the rules and regulations fall out of that societal ownership of the commons and where that society wants to put its resources. And I think that if a particular area does not want to have an aquaculture operation, then it's folly to try and put one there. And I think you really have to listen to the local communities. That said, I think there's a lot of misconception about what aquaculture is and how it operates, and that there's an onus on the industry and on NGOs and policymakers to make sure that everyone is educated to the best of their ability on what the particular aquaculture operation in a particular bay may mean for that bay, from an environmental standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a cultural standpoint. But if a bay or a harbor doesn't want the aquaculture, I think you have to look long and hard about trying to push it down on them through some policy mechanism. In the end, I think that'll backfire.
And Suzi, how about you? How do we reconcile the concerns of the local communities with the needs of the broader society?
I have to totally agree with Paul here that if the local community is really against an aquaculture site being in their location, then you should probably respect that. And one of the reasons I say that is because if you end up forcing that site on that community in that area when they don't want it, they'll then go and say to other people, look, this is what this industry has done to us, and there is a likelihood that it could do it to you. And that's not nice for anyone. It's not nice for the industry. It's not nice for the communities. So I think it's much better to be respectful of place attachment, of understanding of local culture, as Luke said. And we've actually got a great example here in Scotland where there's a really big company that went into an island and basically asked the island, all of them, in a meeting and said, do you want a salmon farm in your area? We'll bring you 7 jobs. It will mean, I think it was 2 extra houses. And the community, they went away, they spoke, they came back and said, look, we really don't think it's for us. And the company walked away. And now I think it's 7 years later, they're going back and saying, it's 7 years down the line, have you changed your minds? And the answer is yes, they've changed their minds. So it's doing it in a collaborative way can be actually quite beneficial.
Was there any public engagement that was going on in the meantime, do you know, in that 7-year period? I mean, what was it that changed these communities' minds? Do you know?
I don't know specifically, but I can suspect that it's socioeconomic. So if you're, a lot of the rural areas in Scotland, they're seeing a decline in population and aging populations, and that's putting a lot of pressure on our resources. So 10 years ago, you might not have needed those extra jobs, but perhaps now you do. So you might revisit or reconsider these types of things.
Yeah, I would echo what both Suzi and Paul are saying. And there's an interesting example that from North Carolina, where it's kind of the opposite of what Suzi just described happened, where over a decade ago, some interested oyster farmers from outside a community came in. Actually, I think it may have been clams, to create farms in a sound that bordered kind of a long-standing fishing community with a lot of history, and didn't do a lot of farming. And just given the rules at the time, they were able to open and operate that farm. And what ended up happening is that there was a lot of concern and backlash from the community. They didn't want those farms there, especially from outsiders. And they actually went through an escalation process and had a moratorium placed on the entire sound bordering their communities for all future aquaculture farms. And it was a moratorium that kind of was renewed. It had sort of unclear and indefinite terms to it. And so now, over a decade later, there's definitely kind of some shifting interest in things like aquaculture. And I think it's a case of, is it possible to lift this moratorium and potentially allow aquaculture operations in the area? So that sort of, local resistance or engagement and lack of engagement, it can have these real kind of long-term effects. And, now as people's minds may be changing, or as environmental or economic conditions are changing, you kind of have to wrestle with those, impacts and mistakes that were made earlier in terms of how aquaculture was approached in the area and whether it, engaged with the community or not.
And so once again, that points beautifully to, again, being a good neighbor. So if you go in and you kind of bulldoze your way in and maybe don't take into account that two-way dialogue, you're setting a bad example, and that could also maybe have ripple effects for other businesses that then want to farm in those waters. Is that an accurate assumption?
Yeah, for sure.
So based on what you guys have said, don't force it. If the community does not want it in their backyard, they do not want it in their backyard. But there are other ways to engage. So for example, we could have broader policies that reduce some of those risks and uncertainties and get more people to feel a little bit more comfortable with these projects being proposed in their backyard. You can educate these communities through various mechanisms, which Polly will talk to you about in a moment. And it's about building those two-way relationships. It's about having those conversations, both having the community being able to provide their comments and their feedback, but then also having the farms themselves also engage with those communities. Is that accurate? So, Paul, what role then, and you alluded to this, you mentioned this, that NGOs can play a role, and environmental organizations can play a role in helping to address some of these concerns that these communities have. So can you give us expand on that a little bit more? What role can the environmental community play to help ease some of these concerns that people have about marine aquaculture?
The environmental community really does have a strong voice and an ability to communicate its position to a broad audience in an impactful way. And sometimes there are environmental organizations that are opposed to a particular form of aquaculture or a location. Again, it's all local, and there are others that are trying to encourage it. So my project is called Advancing Aquaculture for Climate Change Gains. And I'll give you an example. When we went for the first seaweed farm lease off Maine waters, all the aquaculture leases have a public hearing, and they're usually pretty well attended, and there's stakeholders from all across the spectrum, and everyone gets to get up and say their piece. And the president at the time of the Conservation Law Foundation, which is a legal advocacy group for the environment headquartered in Boston, came up to that hearing and stood up and said, for the first time ever in our 26 years or so, we are actually encouraging this aquaculture lease. We think it's good for the environment, it's good for the community, it's going to create jobs, and it'll create nutritious food products. And that was a sea change. And that really just shifted the whole tenor of the public hearing. And so NGOs, environmental NGOs, have a lot of sway. What we're doing is trying to educate. These are all emotional issues, but we're trying to develop data and understanding around the science around these farms and how they interact with the environment and what are some of the ecosystem services they provide and some of the environmental challenges, so that at least there's a base level of understanding, and that we're going to try to take as much emotion as can be taken out of the conversation through research into physically what's happening in the farms, and we're also doing research on the social science around these farms so that we can use it to inform the public.
And I'm glad that we have two social scientists on the line with us. And I think oftentimes when we think about, as conservation organizations, we get lost in the science about the physical potential impacts and benefits. We look at what will happen with the surrounding ecosystem. Will it affect local wildlife? But what we often kind of forget to take a step back and look at is, what about those communities and society? Because ultimately, with these sustainable development activities, what we're trying to do is meet the needs of human beings on the planet without destroying it. So, Suzi, I don't know if you want to maybe talk a little bit about the important role of what you do. Why is it so important for us to include society and understanding society's role and interactions with these activities in terms of furthering conservation?
Sure. So obviously, we've talked about how society interacts with policy and policy interacts with society. But essentially, all of our policies come from what we want at the time as a collective and who we're voting in. So it's incredibly important to include people's preferences and people's local ecological knowledge in our understanding of how we address some of these really tricky challenges. You talked about climate change earlier. We can do all the natural science in the world to find out how we solve climate change and what's causing it, but really it's human behavior and changing human behavior that will solve it. And you can't do that overnight. You have to understand what people are feeling, what they're thinking, and try and, if possible, change perspectives, change minds, educate, understand and listen as well. And I think one of the other things that I wanted to touch on here was there's a lot of conversation around dialogue, around ensuring that we have community voices, but it's also ensuring that we do something about it. So it's putting that into action. So if a community says that they don't want aquaculture in one area, then don't put it in that area. It's not, oh, we've listened to you, but now we're just going to put it there anyway. So I think that's one of the major aspects of social science and social research. And that's how we can help, is to try and understand these underlying feelings and bring them to the fore, and perhaps give a little bit more voice in the academic arena in particular.
And Luke, do you have anything to add to the important role that social science should play in conservation activities? Why should the environmental community care about social science?
Yeah, I think Suzi, everything she said, I would agree with, especially the part about, we can get the data, but we need to understand human behavior so that we know how we use and respond to scientific data. I guess at a more maybe specific level, one thing that I think is often lacking when it comes to environmental planning and aquaculture planning is that we often have a lot of biological and spatial ecological data. So, when it comes to citing things, a lot of our citing tools, a lot of our mapping tools, a lot of our decision-making tools provide us with those data, but oftentimes social data are missing, particularly social data that are linked to geography, linked to spaces, linked to places and communities. So, on a more specific level, if we could find ways to incorporate social information, cultural information, kind of on the same level and within some of the same tools and decision-making processes, we can hopefully have more holistic decision-making that takes them directly into account and acts on those things in the same way that we often already act on ecological or other data. It's a difficult process because these are, often kind of qualitatively different things we're dealing with, whether it's human perceptions, people's social values, cultural concerns, but it's critical. And I think it often, the success or failure of a lot of environmental policies hinges on those things. So I guess that's sort of a more, operational specific thing, building off of, what Suzi was saying, just about the importance of understanding and listening to people's concerns overall.
So it is very important. I like, Luke, what you said, that social science and understanding the social dimension helps us provide a more holistic picture of these issues, but then also, to Suzi's point of taking action, it can also help us design more effective solutions and ways to take action, because ultimately, again, at the end of the day, it is about, as you said, Suzi, human behavior. We could have all the data in the world in terms of how it impacts things physically, but if we don't know how to apply that in life and society, it's really probably not going to go anywhere. All right, so we've learned that social science plays a really key, important role in helping us to better create solutions so that we're not just understanding the biological and physical elements, but we're also understanding that and how to apply that into society and actual solutions that society will accept. We've learned that in order to garner public support, it requires two-way dialogue, and as Suzi very importantly mentioned, so it's about the communities having that opportunity to provide feedback and comments, but then also the farms or the regulators or whoever is on the other end, it's also their responsibility to actually listen and take in what those people are saying and then actually act upon that. So for example, if a community really doesn't want the farm, maybe it's not the best idea to put the farm there. However, there are other top opportunities potentially to start to garner support with these communities. As Paul has also mentioned, people are starting to warm to the idea of aquaculture. Suzi's given an example of a community that 7 years down the line decided that they were okay with it. and it could in fact go in their backyard. So there are some education and outreach opportunities, and the environmental community can play a really big role in helping to get broader audiences to understand the role that marine aquaculture can play in meeting the demands of a growing population and a changing climate. So really, the big question on the table then here is, and Suzi, we're going to start with you, put you in the hot seat here. Can we develop a marine aquaculture sector in countries like the US and the UK that is economically viable but also environmentally sustainable? And can we do it now?
Oh, that's a really tough question. I'm not an economist and I'm not an environmental scientist, so I wouldn't be able to say either or, but I certainly think we can improve from where we are now. And one of the ways that we can do that is to actually include society in dialogue around where aquaculture is sited, what the concerns are, and also include local ecological knowledge. Because as Paul was saying, a lot of folk have lived in the area their whole lives. They know everything about their sea. They know the water quality. They know, what's on the sand. We have divers in our local area. They regularly do transects just for the fun of it. So including that is a really good idea. And I also think one of the other things that's important is that the more information we have about an area from a social, environmental, and economic perspective, the less space there is for misinformation. And if it's open and honest, and if it's out there, then we can make better decisions, because then we can talk about it and people have informed conversations. So yeah, can't answer your question directly, but I tried.
That's fair. So Luke, how about you? I know you were also a social scientist. We'll give this a shot here. Can we develop a marine aquaculture sector in the U.S. that is economically viable and environmentally responsible? And can we do it now?
I'll go out on a limb and say, can we? Yes. Will we? I think that's to be determined. I think that there's, something that's interesting about the U.S. context is that there are a lot of different types of coastal and ocean spaces, which creates a lot of different types of opportunities for different forms of aquaculture, different species, and different sorts of interactions with people in the places where the aquaculture is happening. So, this just it offers a lot of different potential pathways to grow the industry. And, over the past decade or two, we've seen a lot of reform and expansion of the shellfish industry in a lot of states, particularly on the East Coast. Now we see growing interest in seaweed farming, and there's a lot of potential there. I think the key is really, we need, like Suzi was saying, we need to take into account, what the public thinks and what the local communities think, where these operations are happening or are expected or anticipated to happen, and take advantage of the variety of places where we could grow the industry. So if it's not going to work in one place for ecological reasons, we might try another place. Similarly, if it's not going to work in one place for social reasons, we should also try another place. We shouldn't try to force it in the same way that don't force it when the water conditions aren't right or the nutrient levels aren't right or whatever it may be. So I think, with advances in new creative forms of aquaculture, there's a potential to really expand the industry in this country in a sustainable way. But I think we have to think creatively about how we do that and think holistically about how we do that as we move forward.
How about you, Paul? Can we develop a responsible marine aquaculture sector in the U.S. that is both